So yeah, here we are in the Presidio. I'm visiting San Francisco. We spent a bunch of time together on Friday, which was really nice. And yeah, when the topic of midnight came up, you came to mind as somebody who has been at Esalen, which I'd love to hear you describe what the heck Esalen is, if you can. And, you know, midnight in the best sense of a new day and in the most threatening sense of the darkest hour. It's something that, you know, I think if both of us have experienced personally, and is also part of your work, given what you have to shepherd.
Well, Esalen Institute is, a learning center on the edge of a cliff. A sort of center of gravity for unusual people. It has a long history that I won't describe here, but we'll say that it's standing. It's been there for 60 years, and it brings through all kinds of strange phenomena that we'd never really understand until hindsight is available. So yeah, that's my best description of Esalen right off the bat.
Cool. Do you think there's something particular about like California that's uniquely suited to hold a place like Esalen?
Yeah, I think that Esalen's sort of situated in that historical moment of the 60s, and California was so central to that, and we come from that time and place and moment. California also just has that landscape. Someone once described to me Big Sur as being a really dramatic landscape, and so obviously if that's going to be the stage for what's going on, then it's going to be a ton of drama. So there is a way where that piece of California is really well situated for holding that piece of what's going on, which is, I don't know, it all feels like it has an exclamation point on it.
So there's something about the place and the mandate that just like stews or like manages to situate itself in the center of like human dramas, personal dramas, and is like the serene place to explore that.
Yeah, I don't always think it's serene.
It's not serene.
But yeah, it's definitely a place to explore it. And I think from the outside it looks pretty serene.
From the outside, right, but then you step in and it's like
being inside of a wave, which I guess is helpful for the waves being right there.
Right, inside of a wave?
Yeah. Inside of a wave.
That makes a lot of sense. I don't know how to explain how that makes sense, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of surrender involved. There's a lot of best not to fight it, and a lot of constant movement.
Constant movement. I love talking to you about these themes because I feel like both of us are people who are very personally involved with like our work or anything we dedicate ourselves to, so that experience of being in the wave is like both like external in terms of the work we're trying to put in the world, and also like internal in terms of like what we choose to engage with in ourselves.
Yeah. The moon's up there.
I noticed the moon. Yeah, it's very nice hanging up above the trees.
It's staring at us. It's getting less full. It's going to be a new moon pretty soon. And I was thinking about that a little bit on the way over here, about how new moons and midnights kind of feel similar to me, sort of all the way at zero. So it feels good to have it sort of looking down on
watching
us. Yeah, like peeking out.
And the new moon sits kind of opposite of the midnight point, right? Like you get a new moon. The new moon happens when the moon is between the Earth and the sun, right? Full moon is when, right? Am I getting that right?
You're asking me
astrological questions that are
I
a
don't
little.
know the answer to. But when I think of midnight, I think of like 0 hour, or just and 0 indicates emptiness to me. And so whether or not it looks like the midnight point on a clock, it feels like midnight.
feel right. That new moon hanging in the sky feels like a reset. It's a new beginning. My experience of the past several months has been like feeling like we're at that midnight point of like a changeover or an emptying out, and I've been searching for a way to kind of like start the new thing or feel like I'm like stepping into the new day, and yet it still felt like I've been lost in the dark, which has been sort of tragic because the pandemic has been loosening up, at least here in the US. I mean, there's parts of the country that are still really suffering and we still have to take precautions, but it's nothing like it was before we were vaccinated. And so for me to be in this life moment of wanting to feel that new day starting, and yet still feeling stuck in my darkest hour has been kind of harrowing. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about how Esalen can draw people in who, I don't know, you put it better, but there's like where they're searching for something in themselves, and Esalen will kind of like show them the lesson that they need. Like the place is so beautiful and alluring. People are looking for that respite or that healing, and yet they might still have more darkness to pass through before they get to that healing. And I think that's part of what has been interesting for me, you know, supporting the artist residency at Esalen over the past year is it's mirroring a little bit of my own process of, you know, looking for that sanctuary and that respite and like hopefully offering that to these artists that we're making space for. And yet at the same time, myself being in this process of flailing, to be completely honest.
We love a good flail. By we, that's a royal we, but also Esalen loves a good flail. Yeah, that personal moment. That makes me, what does that bring up for me? A couple of things, as long as we're talking about Esalen. One is that, you know, I went to Esalen, like I landed there because I was flailing and I just didn't want to be anywhere else. And I went there to heal some specific things about the way I do relationship and how I relate to the world, and I ended up working on something totally different, and I have had to be introduced to new pieces of dark night in myself in order to even address those things that I was working on, and yeah, there's sort of a way. You know, I did that at that place, although I think people go through different healing at different points in their lives in different locations. But there is a... So I didn't live at Esalen, but I lived up the mountain, which you never got to see that house. That was a very cool house. It was like a...
You know, I think our first call when you invited me to help the project, you were in, and I was like, where is she? And you're like, oh, I'm just above the cloud cover. And it was like, you know, there was like these sweeping windows in this like elfin, like wooden thing. And I'm like, what is this?
It was the same
I forgot about that call. Now I'm remembering it. I've never been in the house, but yeah, our first call or two, you were in that setting.
That house is all glass, and there's no lights nearby at all. And it's in a forest, and it's, you know, you can kind of see out onto the clouds, but you're really, for the most part, tucked into the trees and into the side of the mountain. And it's in a very precarious place. I have been evacuated from that house for fire and for flood. But one of the greatest things about living in that house was I had to keep myself alive. I was by myself, and there were very pressing matters. There was like, can you chop the firewood? If not, can you get someone else to chop the firewood? Can you drive down in the mud? Can you drive out in the mud? Like, are you going to be able to escape if there is an emergency? Stay warm enough, stay cold enough. Do you have enough food? Do you have enough water? Is the water on? These are all like life matters. And it felt like tending to those life matters oftentimes was a symbol for the work that I was doing on myself. So having to go outside and chop a bunch of wood in the pouring rain and then not be able to use that wood for a long time because it was soaking wet, and then just having to like feel crappy about that and sit in my very cold beautiful glass house and like feel about that. Like, you can really extend that metaphor. It was like living in a little bit of a myth or an altar. I would talk about the house and the whole piece of land as like living on an altar and tending it as, you know, moving pieces of myself and pieces of my life and pieces of my internal and external bits. Yeah.
How long were you in that house?
3 years.
That was full 3 years. Why didn't you take me? Why did we end up there?
I moved by the time you got here.
Oh, darn. Okay. 3 years.
You got as close as most people during the pandemic.
That's true. Right. Because the pandemic involved, you know, Esalen obviously having to shut down just because people can't be hanging out at retreat centers like that. But then there were all these natural disasters happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like a really intense time to be there.
Yeah, it's an intense time to be by yourself, too.
Right.
Especially up on a mountain all by like alone. Alone.
Got it.
But there's also the idea of growing things up there, which was sort of part of the altar. I had like a big garden in the chicken coop, and I'm a really bad gardener. And there were things that grew in my garden. It was not usually what I intended to grow.
Right, sure.
As Big Sur has a lot of native mugwort, and I'm not totally sure how it got there, but I was like trying to grow sweet peas and I got a lot of mugwort.
Pretty different.
Pretty different.
Can you eat mugwort?
You can.
But you didn't.
I didn't. It's not the same as sweet peas.
Yeah.
But it's good for burning and it's good for tea and it's good for poison oak, which is also good because I got poison oak on my face twice during the pandemic.
Oh, there's the sculpture.
Yeah.
We did. We sailed right past it, didn't we?
We did. We sailed right past it.
Poison oak.
Poison oak so bad that my eyes swelled shut and I hallucinated. Talk about a darkest hour. By myself. I'm wondering about your dark hour. And less about the facts and more about the way it feels.
Mm-hmm.
When we were talking about the moon and I was talking about it feeling like midnight, I know that a lot of my way of processing the world is how it feels. It's not what it looks like, it's not what it says, but how it feels. So yeah, I'm curious, how does a dark hour feel?
I think part of the reason it feels so dark is because it's believing that there's light on the other side feels abstract. Mm-hmm. Like I don't feel that there is light on the other side. I can talk myself into knowing that light will come, but it's this like willful intellectual exercise. Mm-hmm. And like the felt sense is that I have fallen into the darkness and I will never be found again. Mm-hmm. And the sadness and panic that comes with that is very hard to stomach. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so a lot of the work of being in the darkness has been trying to find a way to be still in it, to see what moves around me instead of like flailing so that I'm making a lot of the movement. And that's been hard. Yeah, because I'm kind of like I have in some ways maximum freedom right now, but like no context. And so it's like there's just like nothing to anchor myself to. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the darkness brings up a lot of fear and sorrow, and then on top of that, there is the fear and sorrow of like, will this be forever? Mm-hmm. And I'm starting, like, I keep getting like little inclinations of like, no, this is not forever. There's something after this, mm-hmm. and like I can believe that. And I see other people who've gone through their dark hour and they're no longer in that. Like I know that everything changes. So it's like, how do I do my dark hour? Like for a while it was like, oh, let me just grieve. Mm-hmm. And I had this faith that like if I grieve, then like it will slough off of me. And like that hasn't quite happened. It's like I grieved and I'm not like grieving like I was. and yet I'm still in it. And it's like, so it brings up this rage of like, what are the tools that work for this? What is the guidance that I need?
Hurry up.
Hurry up and go, darkness. Yeah. Yeah.
Hurry up.
So that's what it feels like. Can you relate? Or is your darkness different?
Oh, what's my darkness like? I can't quite call on it. It's not super available to me at the moment.
That's good, don't let it.
When you were describing yours, the vision I had, going back to the having to pee metaphor, going outside in the dark, it's pitch dark. It's middle of the night, and I have to go outside and find a place outdoors to cop a squat. And then seeing a skunk saunter by. And, you don't want to surprise a skunk, especially when you're mostly naked. And so just like squatting and waiting for the skunk to pass in its own time, and they really take their time. They're digging in the dirt, they're smelling everything. And not really having much to say about that, not having much control, just having to wait that out. And how frustrating that is when I'd really just rather go back to sleep. Which is, not to make light of your moment, but it does remind me a little bit of,
You just have to wait. Let the skunk do its thing, and then
let the skunk
be able to go back to sleep.
Put your underwear back on and go back inside. I was thinking about how personal to get. I just had this moment of,
We can try it, and always.
I mostly pull from deeply personal stories.
Sure, I do too.
Yeah. Midnight automatically takes me into memories of medicine ceremony and that community, because I feel like that's where we face that the most.
So doing like plant medicine and psychedelics in a very intentional setting.
Yeah, and being around people who are integrating that kind of work, who have like just been shaken. I mean, that's kind of what Eslen's doing, right? It's dealing with people who have just been shaken, whether by plant medicine or any of the other medicines the world has to offer. Introducing crisis and how it gets resolved. Those are personal things.
Yeah. Well, let's find another spot, and then we can get a little more personal. We spent 10 or so hours in the car on Friday, and somewhere around hour 5 or 6, you're behind the wheel and you almost jump out of your seat and you're like, ooh, let me tell you the story. And I knew the story involved profound grief and loss, and we were already kind of deep in conversation about present things, and I was not sure I could hold the story then. And I said, next time we do this, can you tell me the story then? Having no idea that we were going to be, here today.
Yeah.
But this is the next time. So.
Yeah, and I remember that enthusiasm because I had asked you if you had ever grieved a person. You were grieving a moment or an
situation.
identity.
Yeah, maybe an identity. I don't even know what I'm grieving yet. I just know there's a lot of grief. But it wasn't a person. You're right. Yeah, and you asked me if I had grieved a person, and I haven't experienced a lot of death in my life.
Yeah, so that story. And we were driving by the neighborhood where my friend Alexis had grown up. This is a story about my dad and Alexis, and my dad died of cancer after 10 years of estrangement between us. And when he called me to tell me he was diagnosed, it became really clear to me, only when the elders in my life told me it was clear, that I needed to go to Maine and see him. And that kind of spun into taking care of him a little bit. And a few months into that, it became really clear that the cancer was going to win, and he was going to go into hospice, out of palliative care and into hospice. And so we decided to bring him to California for those last months. And he was staying in Santa Cruz with my aunt and uncle. And there was some weird and interesting times down there. My biological family, his family really rallied around him, and we spent a lot of time together, even though none of us are particularly well equipped for that type of moment. But anyway, when it became really clear that his last days were coming, I didn't have a ride back to San Francisco. I was down in Santa Cruz with him, and I didn't have a ride back to San Francisco. And so my oldest childhood friend and the daughter of his best friend, my dad's best friend, came down to say goodbye to him with me. She showed up with a box of pictures and her boyfriend, and we ate lunch and looked at the pictures with him, and he was sort of in and out of consciousness. And we each said goodbye. And I remember sitting on the steps, my aunt and uncle have a yard with some stone steps, actually kind of like this, and she just sort of sat down next to me and anchored me to the ground. And that embodied sensation is still something I'm very attracted to in people, is when they sit down next to me, she kind of leaned into me and put her weight down on me. And then she gave me a ride home. And he did die a couple of days later. And Alex, that friend, and her dad organized the memorial, the public memorial for my dad, which I didn't want anything to do with. I was still angry at him, plus he was dead, and I didn't want to hear anybody tell me what a great person he was. I wasn't ready for that. So she really shepherded me through that whole experience. She sort of sat me on her porch and brought me a bottle of tequila and would bring people out to talk to me and tell stories that she thought were good and kind of cue them up. She just made that experience bearable.
She really shepherded you through that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you know how she knew how to do that?
I think she was taking cues from her dad. I also think she was we both grew up together in political families, and so we were sort of surrounded by hosts and people, diplomats of various kinds, and I think we both learned that skill. But she was particularly good at it in this moment, and I think it had to do with the fact that she loved me so much and knew what I was about, knew when I was unhappy, and knew what was funny, and she cared a lot about good jokes. So she really wanted to bring those into the situation. We had a second memorial for my dad. He was cremated, so we spread his ashes in the bay, and we went out on a boat. And I invited Alex to that memorial as well, but she didn't want to come because she was in a sailboat race around the Farallones. And I was like, that's fine, no big deal, you've done plenty. I'll call you if there's an extra ticket to the game. We were going to the Giants game that night. And so we spread my dad's ashes, and there was an extra ticket to the game, and I called her, and she didn't pick up. And the next morning, her dad called to tell me that her boat had capsized, and that she had been lost at sea, and that the Coast Guard was looking for her body, but nothing had been found yet. And she was lost with 2 other people. And so,
big accident.
Yeah, big accident. And Alex and my dad went into the ocean on the same day. Same-ish ocean, bay and ocean, but still.
Very close.
Very close in time and in space. And there's a lot of drama around her disappearance and finding her body and not finding her body and how we dealt with that, and that was really distracting for a month. And then to sort of add to the surreal moment, she was the first Batgirl for Major League Baseball, and her memorial was on the field at the baseball park in San Francisco. And I spoke after a very famous baseball player and in front of hundreds of people for the first time in my life. And so in addition to this, oh my God, what's happening, there's oh my God, what is happening?
Do you remember what you said?
I remember, the only thing I remember is I closed with a joke, and the joke was she and I used to torture her brother. She used to torture her brother. I participated when I was around. He was older. He's got his shit together. Neither one of us really still are there. And so I closed it, and I said, you know, Alex was a true friend to me, and in honor of her, I'm going to take on her lifelong work of bugging the shit out of Chris. And it made Chris laugh, and it made me feel like she was there, because that is something she would say, and that made me really happy. And to be able to like say that out loud in front of that many people, to get it, let's be honest, to be able to say anything loud in front of that many people was probably a stretch for me at that time. Really opened up a lot, actually. But then when that was over, I had to deal with the knives in my gut. And those lasted and lasted. They were completely distracting. I was in law school, and I was working for a senator, and I was about to be married, and I was stuck
With these knives.
And I didn't know how to get them out. I didn't have the tools. And so I had to ask for help from anyone who would offer. I couldn't not talk about these deaths. I was absolutely that person at the party who was just like, how am I? Let me tell you this intense story. And then I just started asking friends for help, and someone introduced me to an IFS practitioner who had shamanic practices that she introduced to me, a psychic and medium who helped me speak with my loved ones, and a psychedelics medicine practitioner. So I sat in ceremony. And these were all things I had never done before, never considered before, and was definitely too skeptical to handle before. But they helped a lot. And I was able to remove the knives from my gut, which did not end the grief, but it did end this sort of need to lay on my stomach all the time and just hurt. Yeah, that was, shortly thereafter, not shortly, probably a year after, I started practicing Buddhist meditation. And about a year after that, I started a course called Year to Live as a student, which is based on Stephen Levine's book. And that's a year-long course where you start with a terminal diagnosis and really explore what it means to be personally facing your own mortality. And I would say that was where a lot of the integration happened. And a lot of this sort of, I'm taking this very juicy, very intense experience and putting it away in parts of my being where it can be really useful. And that was the year that, I changed everything. I changed the entire way I live my life.
And now 10 years later, you're in the maelstrom of Esalen.
Yeah.
Living alone on a mountainside.
Yeah, or something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah. But definitely in the maelstrom. And that experience and the integration experiences afterward were what suggested to me that it was time to consider experiences that weren't like just in service of material reality, to consider pursuits that weren't just in the interest of achievement or success. And really consider what I care about, because death will do that. And now I feel so attached, I don't feel like I can do anything unless it's the most meaningful. Maybe that's the next thing I'm going to have to process. Because death's always on the table.
Right. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I admire this story and the mastery that you have over it, because I can only imagine what it took to gain that mastery. Because I'm sure the experience of it was quite harrowing.
It was. But it's, I was thinking the other day about how lucky I am to be one of those people who expects things to be really hard, and then occasionally I'm gifted with really easy experiences. Because I think it would be much worse to expect things to be easy and be hit with difficult experiences. And so I'm glad to be in the first camp.
I find I waste a lot of energy on the anticipation, though. And I wish I could have less of that dreading anticipation. Because it's like when something actually is really bad, like I'm not anticipating it. And so like why bother with the anticipation in the first place? And oftentimes people have described me as a very patient person. I think you even highlighted this at some point recently, and I received it with such dread. Because usually when people point out how patient I am, it means I'm being patient with a situation that others wouldn't be, and perhaps it is not the time to be patient. So, but we come back to that theme of flailing. It's like, you know, we started out with this notion of flailing. People come to Esalen flailing.
We love a good flail.
Yeah. Like, where can I, like, is there a flail that will get me into something different? Or, like, is it a matter of finding a place to flail where I don't do damage or, you know?
We should all find a place to flail where we don't do damage, particularly to ourselves. If you hit your arm on something, then you have to deal with the damage to your arm. That's definitely, especially in the dark.
Minimum. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'm low on hope. I arrived low on hope. I wanted to like draw out a hopeful moment. I wanted to get you to say something hopeful about what could happen. But I think the most hopeful thing I've heard you say in the last 5 days is that everything changes.
Right, everything changes. Right, so I look at friends I know and like friends that I've been there with them in dark moments or confusing, harrowing moments where there's really nothing I could do but be there with them. And now I see them in a different place. And it's like, oh yeah, everything changes. And most of these, like when I think through these friends, it's like mostly they got themselves out of it. Like they did things to change their situation. So it's like, okay, so I need to do something to change my situation. It's not going to happen fast, but like I need to move myself out of this like heartbroken moment of disillusionment. And I think you mentioned, like, when you mentioned the things I could be mourning, you mentioned an identity, and I was like, oh, she saw it. She saw it in a way I didn't see it. Where like, yeah, there might be an identity and I'm mourning, and yet I'm somebody who has had such a shifting identity all through my life, and so it's like, what was I clinging to that I didn't even realize I was clinging to that I've now lost?
I once burned an identity in a fire on the beach, sort of offhand. It was like I was just walking on Ocean Beach and people had fire pits and it was the solstice, and I was like, I had already been processing this change in my life, and I was like, I'm just going to write it on a piece of paper and burn it. I ended up drawing it and I burned it and I went into crisis. I wasn't ready for that at all. I thought that I had already dealt with it, but something about that experience of putting that in the fire, it took me months to just reorient. And it was an identity that I hadn't been wearing for a long time.
Still had a place in you.
But it still had a place in me. And I was still clinging to the maybe. So I think that identities are the hardest things to grieve. They're so personal. They're the closest to your own mortality.
Right. Yeah. So I might be experiencing a little death.
We all are.
Sure.
All the time.
Hope. You wanted some hope from me? What is the hope? I mean, that's the problem with midnight, you know, is like dawn is so far away, even if it's coming. And I'm just feeling that distance.
It's also the best thing about midnight. It's the best thing about that phase where the seed is under the soil and it's got zero light, and it could be anything. It could be sweet peas or it could be mugwort. Who knows? It's going to be under there for a while, and if it was really, really scared, it wouldn't open. It wouldn't dare poke up. Endless possibility.
Just gotta lose the fear.
I mean, instructions like that are hard to follow.
They are hard to follow.
I also think that time is hopeful. Linear time.
In terms of things will change.
It's probably not real, but we experience it.
Right, it's our experience of,
Yeah, and you can depend on it to advance.
And change. Yeah, that's what I've been saying. Things change.
Yeah, but you've been saying it like you're trying to convince yourself.
And that's what a lot of people have been wishing for me, is that I just experience some sanctuary. Yeah.
It's a good thing for a midnight
sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you, Ida.
Hi, I'm Jerry Michalski, and I am StoryThreading Unfinished 2021. StoryThreading is not graphic recording, meaning I'm not trying to create a visual capture of what was said exactly at the event. I'm trying to thread nuggets that I hear along the way into a different story, into a narrative that sort of broadens the conversation. So we're looking here at my story threading tool. Other story threaders will use completely different tool sets. This happens to be one that, as you'll see, I'm quite addicted to and reasonably quick with. And I'm showing you here a node in my brain. Each node is called a thought that I created for the story threading of the Unfinished 2021 conference. So the theme of this conference is midnight. Here are some of the speakers. Here's Ida, Benedetto, and Jessica Hartzell, whose event I will actually go story thread in just a moment. But here are some other sorts of people. And in fact, here's Christian Movila and Capuchin Gros, who are the organizers, some of the organizers of this event. So if I go back to the story threading and look for Ida and Jess at Unfinished, their session is called Midnight Sanctuary. And I've watched it, and I kind of want to do two things. I want to show you what notes I took here and refresh your memory about what was said in that conversation, just briefly. So at the very beginning, they talk about the lunar phases. They talk about the moon and where it is. And so this is, if I click right now, it'll take us to the Wikipedia page for lunar phases. So here's Wikipedia, just a corner of it, but this is the Wikipedia on lunar phases, right? And I had that in my brain already because I had the moon and so forth, but I didn't have full moon, gibbous moon, crescent moon. I added those as a result of listening to Ida and Jess, which only goes to show you that I'm a little bit distractible. Here is Ida, who teaches at the D School, which is the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford. So do these other people. She has a website called Uncommon Places. She is a user experience expert and used to work at Stone Yamashita. Jess is at Esalen, which is a noted institute that comes out of the human potential movement from back in the 60s. Interesting people taught there like Abraham Maslow, Fritz Perls, George Leonard, and lots of others. They also talked about mugwort and later also sweet pea. So mugwort is a flowering plant that I added. And one of the statements that came through was, at midnight, the seed could be anything. It could be sweet peas, it could be mugwort, which I thought was really a nice capture for a piece of what was happening, because a lot of what was being talked about was dealing with loss or coping with grief, and which is a node that I had done a lot of work with over time. So I have it under grief and loss, but also there's notions of healthy grieving. There's a website called Modern Loss There's a poem called Meditation at Lagunitas by, let's find out who, by Robert Haas. So a lot of the conversation seemed to be about coping with grief, and my take on it was really about how to react to events. How we react to events is incredibly important. Very often we are hijacked. Our brains, it's called limbic hijacking or amygdala hijacking, whatever you want to call it. But basically, we get triggered, we run off, and suddenly we're really not conscious of what we're doing. We may react very emotionally, we may react with incredible grief and so forth. And I think one of the really important things in life is to figure out that how we react changes how events unfold, changes how events actually get recorded in our bodies, and how events affect our future lives. So one person said, if you can change how you label events, you can change your reactions. This comes from The Ultimate Reframe, which was written by Michael Burnoff, who has some interesting ideas about 6 steps to make sure that the shit that happens to you doesn't bother you, for example. So I actually want to take this conversation in the direction of one of my favorite words, which is grace. And I want to dwell on grace just a tiny bit as a way of expanding this conversation. Certainly, I mean grace under pressure, which is really interesting, like how do you keep calm when events are really happening. I've got that linked to stress reduction tools and techniques, which is kind of normal. But also, back to grace, sorry. But also this idea of, I'm not really talking about the Christian notion of grace, or other kinds of religious divine grace, God's grace. Those are not the kinds of grace that I'm thinking about. And divine grace in Hinduism is known as Kripa, and is the basis for Kripalu Yoga, which is one of many different types of yoga. So there's laughter yoga, Kundalini yoga, Raja, Vini, Yin, Yoga Nidra, Karma, Integral, Hot, Hatha, etc. Just to show you what happens when you feed one memory for 23 years. So that's what I've been doing with this mind map. That's the reason it has so many strange things in it. Kind of the place I want to go in grace is, for example, something I call the grace factor, which is a mind hack I learned long ago. I've forgotten where I learned it from. But basically, you're driving. Some small percentage of the time that you're driving, things will go wrong. You'll blow a tire, your battery will die, you'll be in an accident. When those things do go wrong, kind of one way of seeing them is to be happy that the percentage, your grace factor, let's call it 1% of the time you're driving, is getting smaller. You've used up some of your grace factor. So that's one way of thinking about grace and events. Another way is, a really long time ago, I was a technology trends analyst, and our vice president of sales came back from a meeting with IBM extremely upset and concerned because the prospect he was pitching at IBM had my written article in front of him, all marked up in red, and it's like, Jerry, you've got to get on the phone with this guy. And the weekend passed, I think Monday, Tuesday, I got on the phone with Dave Liddell from IBM, and he was really thoughtful at the beginning of the call. And he started the call by saying, over the weekend I was reading this book, and I don't remember what the book was, and he says, and I have a feeling we're using the same words with very different meanings. And long story short, I had written an article about IBM's Image Plus offer, a technical thing, and I had said that it was neither strategic nor open. And yet, within the world of IBM, Image Plus was certainly part of their strategic product offers, and it was more open than most anything else IBM had done because you could kind of reach in and grab an image and reach in and put an image into the software, which, seeing from the outside in, from my vantage point, was clearly not very open, me being a huge fan of open source, which was already a growing movement back then. And then strategy being really about corporate strategy and a whole bunch of other things. And for me, saving dead images into CD-ROMs at the time was really not strategic. So we agreed that we disagreed on words, and he became my client and proceeded to receive my written research. We had a great relationship after that. Whole story to say that for some reason I entered that conversation calmly, and he entered that conversation kind of in a state of grace about it, because what could have been a really messy conversation about what was happening turned out to be really good. So that's my story about states of grace, and this is the beginning of our story threading. So we're just experimenting here. All your feedback is really valuable. I hope you're really enjoying Unfinished 21, and I'll see you with some more of these. Thanks.